Hello students, in this learning module, the main objectives in the module are to understand concept of maturation and learning, concept of learning curve, role of motivation, reward and punishment in learning. The purpose of the module is to understand the concept of maturation, which means involving the organism's biological process and the resulting changes, and the concept of learning, which means relatively permanent changes in the behavior of an organism or individual, and the concept of learning with significant breaks for the renewed motivation in the learning curve is also discussed. It is further described in detail about the role of motivation in the process of learning to shape the behavior, and the various reinforcers applied based on trial and error, classical conditioning, instrumental conditioning, and the reinforcers kind of positive, negative, primary, secondary, punishment used in the behavior modification are discussed in detail. Concept of maturation and learning. Maturation is the biological processes involved in the organisms becoming functional and fully developed. Maturation is a process by which change from simple to complex occurs as a result of biological growth and development. It refers to the changes that follow an orderly sequence and are largely dictated by the genetic blueprint which produces commonalities in our growth and development. Once the underlying physical structure is sufficiently developed, proficiency in these behaviors require adequate environment and little practice. However, special efforts to accelerate these behaviors do not help if the infant is maturationally not ready. These processes seem to unfold from within following an inner genetically determined timetable that is characteristic of the species. Maturation is multifaceted and automatic process. There are many types of maturations, for example, physical, cognitive, emotional, somatic, etc. But two most important kinds during childhood are physical and cognitive maturation. Physical maturation indicates the distinct physical changes a person goes through as they progress through their developmental stages. Cognitive maturation refers to the development of children from birth to adulthood. It involves processing of information, language development, reasoning skills, intellect and memory. Now, learning may be defined as any relatively permanent change in behavior or behavioral potential produced by experience. One must remember that some behavioral changes occur due to the use of drugs, etc. Such changes are temporary. They are not considered learning. Changes due to practice and experience which are relatively permanent are illustrative of learning. Learning prepares an individual for the necessary adjustment and adaptation. According to Crow and Crow, learning is acquisition of habits, knowledge and attitudes. It involves new ways of doing things and it operates on an individual's attempts to overcome obstacles or to adjust to new situations. It represents progressive changes in behavior. It enables him to satisfy interests to attain a goal. It can be stated that learning is universal and continuous. It is not limited to any age, sex, race or culture. Framing nature versus nurture debate here, understanding maturation and learning processes through nature and nurture perspective is very essential. On nature side, universal maturational processes guided by genes, heredity, hormones and other biological processes lead to brain growth spurts. In addition to physical, it contributes to various cognitive aspects such as increased memory and problem solving skills, and to psychosocial changes such as increased understanding of other people's feelings, etc. Genetically influenced maturational processes guide all of us through many of the same developmental changes at about the same points in our lives. Meanwhile, individual hereditary endowment is making each person's development unique. So, on the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate is those who emphasize change in response to environment. All the external physical and social conditions, stimuli and events that can affect us, from crowded living quarters and polluted air to social interactions with family members, peer group, teachers, to the neighborhood and broader cultural context in which we develop. Maturation is the continuous, multifaceted and automatic process that drives towards development, and learning is the process through which experience, that is environmental stimuli, it brings about relatively permanent changes in thoughts, feelings or behavior. The concept of learning curve. One of the earliest questions which attracted the attention of learning theories is to study the course of the learning process. They were interested in answering general questions such as, does learning process at a uniform rate throughout the period of learning? Does equal amount of practice at various stages of the learning process result in equal amount of learning? To find answers to such questions, psychologists carried out elaborate experiments on learning of different tasks and arrived at what is familiarly known as learning curve. Learning can be measured in many different ways. Usually we look for either an increase in the number of correct responses or a decrease in the number of errors when we want to know how much learning has taken place or how fast it has occurred. When we plot these measures on a graph, we have learning curves. In most cases, whether we are drawing a graph of errors or of correct responses, the steepest part of the curve will be at the left, which is because the greatest amount of improvement comes early in the learning process. Then, as the increase in learning on each trial becomes smaller and smaller, the curve will gradually level off. The study of the above curve leads us to the following inferences which may answer the above questions. The study reveals the following. Number 1. Learning does not progress at a uniform rate, and that the rate of learning, it varies during the course of learning. The rate of learning is much higher in the initial stages and gradually decreases. This pattern of decrease in the amount learnt as the period of learning increases is known as principle of diminishing returns. It means that even though the time duration and amount of practice remains the same, the amount of learning during a particular time interval and a fixed time of practice is not always the same throughout the learning process. The amount learnt is more per time in the initial stages compared to the later stages. If one observes the curve, it is clear that there are certain stages or periods in the learning effort where no learning takes place. Such a stage is called as plateau, where the curve is seen as flat at these points. This can be due to fatigue, satiation of the nervous system, or decreased motivation, or need to change in the learning strategies. So, all the factors mentioned together can contribute to such flat or plateaus on learning curve. So, it is very much evident based on experiments finding that learning is effective under conditions where the individual is allowed some breaks at various stages along with renewed motivation at time intervals. Foundations of learning. In the first place, all learned responses involve modifications of the organism. These are usually conducive to improved adaptation. The only exception is when bad habits are learned. Acquiring skills and information is obviously adaptive. Learning not to do something injurious or painful is also adaptive. In the second place, the modifications which occur when we learn are dependent upon that happens to us as individuals. They are produced by the effects upon us of changes in stimulation by activity, practice, special training, observation, or a combination of these. It is important to recognize these foundations of learning for the reason that unlearning modifications of behavior also occur. So, this is especially so during the early months and years of human life due to maturation, and most important through learning. So, reinforcement is obviously necessary where learning of skills is concerned. It is not so obviously an aspect of conditioning, but even here, as we pointed out earlier, reinforcement of some kind of seems necessary. So, instrumental conditioning provides reinforcement in the organism's response, bring food or escape. Classical conditioning may also involve reinforcement in this sense, that is to say, the conditioned responses may relieve tension or expectation. So, what is emphasized in the examples which follow is the relative effectiveness of different kinds and degrees of reinforcement. Role of motivation under this: motivate means to move, to activate. In this general sense, anything that initiates activity, whether external or internal, is motivating. In psychology, however, the term motivation and motivate refer to activation from within the organism. So, motivation is a condition that energizes behavior and gives it direction. All living organisms have survival needs, and human beings in addition have growth needs. Motivation is a mental as well as physiological state which arouses an organism to act for fulfilling the current needs. In other words, motivation energizes an organism to act vigorously for attaining some goal. Such acts persist until the goal is attained and the need is satisfied. A person's motivation for learning something arises from two sources. The person learns many things because he or she enjoys them, that is intrinsic motivation, or they provide the individual the means for attaining some other goal, that is extrinsic motivation. So, the motivated organism, the one with needs, tensions or expectations, usually does something about the situation in which it finds itself. It explores or it manipulates the situation or that part it surrounds. So, eventually it may do something which reduces the tension, thus reinforcing the response. Primary reinforcement is conceived by Hull not as need reduction in itself, but as strengthening of the stimulus response connection which accompanies need reduction to secondary reinforcement. Primary reinforcement in the sense of dependence of connections upon biological need reduction is most evident in the learning of hungry animals given a food reward or of thirsty ones given water. So, one may recall from our discussion of needs and drives, however, that certain conditions may have a reinforcing effect without reducing a physiological need or drive. There may be reinforcement from food, for example water, almost immediately, whereas time would be necessary to re-establish bodily equilibrium. So, Hull modified the position by saying that reinforcement may come from drive reduction, which has no necessary physiological connotation. So, he has also credited secondary drives with reinforcing potency. It is clear that such drives do develop and subsequently play an important role in learning. In our society, for instance, the individuals acquired such secondary motivates as the desire for recognition, verbal affection, and for material things including money. In older children and adults, the reinforcers of such secondary drives reinforces like awards for achievement, kind words, money are normally of greater significance than such primary reinforcers as food, etc. And from this negative standpoint, physical punishment also, rewards and punishments in learning. in research on learning, it is almost evident that adequate motivation must be provided. Incentive theories of motivation focus especially on the relationship of learning and experience to the control of motivation. On the whole, the rewarding or effective consequences of an action generally reflect whether that action is worth repeating. Psychologists regard reinforcement as a process sometimes which happens in the individual's nervous system to make learning occur. When a response is followed by reinforcement, it is said to be a neural mechanism which connects a particular response to a particular stimulus. So, now let us discuss about the various types of reinforcements. Reinforcement is the process whereby the delivery of an appetitive stimulus or the removal of an aversive stimulus increase the probability of a behavior. So, what is positive reinforcement? It is delivery of a pleasure or appetitive stimulus that follows a behavioral response, and negative reinforcement is the removal of an unpleasant or aversive stimulus after a behavioral response, and punishment is the presentation of an unpleasant or aversive stimulus after a behavior response, and omission training is the removal of a pleasant or appetitive stimulus after a behavioral response. So, primary reinforcer is a reinforcer that is able to act as a reward independently of prior learning, and secondary reinforcer is a reinforcer that gains its status as a reward at least partly through learning about its relationship with other events. Positive and negative reinforcers, there are procedurally two kinds of reinforcers, as I said, are distinguished as positive reinforcers are those which support the maintenance of behavior like food to hungry person, status, power, money to a worker. They often lead to maintenance of particular response or behavior. So, the factors which bring about this withdrawal are termed as negative reinforcers. For instance, when the management in an industry threatens to withdraw the worker's status and power, it has the same effect. Thus, maintenance of the behavior is the same on the presentation of the above reinforcers simply because it does not want to lose them. So, primary and secondary reinforcers, conceptually these are the two reinforcers which are distinguished. Some incentives are primary reinforcers, meaning that they are able to act as rewards independently of prior learning. For animals, a conditioned stimulus that has been paired with food can serve as an effective reward. In every case, learning is crucial to the formation of secondary reinforcers, or even may play a part in modulating the effectiveness of some primary reinforcers. And children come to value money only after they learn that it will buy chocolates. Chocolates are their primary reinforcers, and chimpanzees learn to work for tokens which can insert into vending machines to get a primary reinforcer like fruits or biscuits. Thus, primary reinforcer is one which directly reduces a primary drive, whereas a secondary reinforcer gets its value by association with a primary reinforcer. Skinner's principles of reinforcement, they were used in a variety of behavioral problems encountered in situations such as industry, school, hospitals, etc. And it was proved to be highly effective and successful. The two main principles of reinforcements are differential reinforcements, that is a routine or pattern of reinforcement which ensures that reinforcement is given when the desired response occurring the presence of particular stimulus configuration, and a schedule of reinforcement, that is a routine or a pattern followed in reinforcing the desired response only on certain occasions. According to Skinner, the typical schedules are fixed ratio schedules, fixed interval schedule, variable interval schedule, and variable interval schedule, fixed ratio schedule. So, this type of schedule involves the presentation of the reinforcement not after every correct response, but after a certain number of correct responses according to fixed ratio, negative reinforcement and punishment means it involves the termination of a pleasant situation, while punishment involves causing an unpleasant condition in an attempt to eliminate undesirable behavior. But both negative reinforcement and punishment, they are not one and the same. And avoidance is learning not to use a response which was acquired earlier, that is called as avoidance, and it is also termed as punishment learning, but which is deliberately avoided, that is avoidance learning, but not punishment. Punishment means learning as a result of punishment. It's a deliberate attempt to reduce the frequency of occurrence of an undesirable response. So, it is defined as a stimulus or event which, when its onset is contingent on the response, and it decreases the likelihood that the response will occur again. So, it refers to the use of punisher to suppress or stop a response from occurring in the future. So, because punishers stop the behavior towards that behavior, we might say that they promote the learning of what not to do. It definitely leads to certain painful stimulations or the threat of such stimulation. So, the most characteristic feature of this operation is the reduction, at least temporarily, of the strength of the response that is being punished. Yet it is not the opposite of reward. If a response is rewarded, it is apparent to the organism in a typical experiment that repetition of this response will be rewarding. But if a response is punished, it is not clear to the organism which of the other available responses will be rewarded. So, in effect, it tells the organism what not to do, but it carries no information by itself which tells an organism what particular alternative course of behavior should be followed. So, that is why it has not always found to be effective. If one's goal is to obtain a large permanent decrease in one's behavior, better that punishment should be immediately introduced, or better that some other alternative reinforcement is also along with the punishment. So, in today's class we have discussed about the process of learning and process of maturation, and how they are interdependent, and the graphical representation of learning as learning curve, and importance of breaks in the process of learning, and various types of reinforcers, especially the role of motivation and primary and secondary reinforcers, especially with regard to rewards and punishments in the modification of behavior.